They buried Earl on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of bruised pewter. The whole town was there, a flock of dark coats and somber faces gathered around a hole in the earth that, to me, felt 50 years in the making. I stood in the front row, where the family would be, if he had any left. They'd asked me to. I was the best friend, after all, the one who'd stood by him at the end. A fine, cold mist beaded on the shoulders of my old wool coat and clung to my eyebrows. I didn't mind it. It felt clean. The preacher's voice was a low drone, a river of platitudes flowing past me, a pillar of the community, a loyal friend, now at peace. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I let my gaze drift across the faces I'd known my whole life. The woman from the diner, her hands clasped tight. The old farmer who'd sold my father the lumber for our barn. Their eyes were red-rimmed, their mouths turned down in practiced sorrow. They saw me looking, and their expressions softened further with a shared, unspoken thought. Look at him. After everything, he's here. He forgave. I allowed a single, perfect tear to track its way down the weathered groove of my weathered cheek. It was not a difficult feat. The emotion was real, a pressurized well of feeling that had been building for most of my 79 years. They just mistook its source. The coffin, a handsome, polished oak thing, hovered over the void. I remembered the weight of it, the solid thump of it on my shoulder with the other pallbearers just an hour before. It had felt no heavier than a box of kindling. The man inside had been hollowed out long before his heart finally stuttered and stopped. The preacher said his final amen. The crowd echoed it, a sigh that was swallowed by the damp air. One by one they filed past, patting my arm, squeezing my shoulder. He thought the world of you, the woman from the diner whispered, her voice thick. Said you were the only one who understood him these last few years. I gave a slow, grave nod. We understood each other, I said, my voice raspy with deliberate emotion. They heard what they wanted to hear. Reconciliation, the healing power of time, a storybook ending for two old men in a small town that cherished its simple narratives. I was the gracious hero who had forgiven a decades-old sin. They never once considered that understanding could be a sharper tool than forgiveness, and that some stories don't end. They just reach a satisfying final page for the right reader. As the crowd began to disperse, heading towards the church hall for the lukewarm coffee and dry sheet cakes that always followed burial, I lingered. I watched two workers in muddy boots begin the task of filling the hole. The first shovelful of dirt hit the polished lid of the casket with a sound that was hollow and final. It was the period at the end of a sentence I had written over 57 long years. I am 79 years old, and I have lived in this same small pocket of the Midwest, nestled between seas of corn and soybean for all of them. It's the kind of place where the soil holds memories as tightly as it holds roots, and a story from your grandfather's day can still be pulled up, whole and detailed, by the right tongue at the diner counter. Gossip doesn't just travel here. It accretes, layer upon layer, until it becomes a kind of truth. I turned from the grave and walked slowly back to my truck, the same one I'd driven for 30 years. The engine coughed to life, a familiar, grumbling sound. As I pulled away from the cemetery, the gray stone markers blurred into a single, monolithic wall of the past. My past. And today, I had just interred the largest, ugliest piece of it. The road home was a straight line cut through fields, fallow and sleeping for the winter. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the tires over the seams in the asphalt was a metronome counting out the years, carrying me back not to the beginning, but to the rupture, to the moment the world I knew cracked open and the man I was supposed to become fell into the fissure. It was the fall of '68. The air itself tasted of promise, of the rich, dusty sweetness of harvested grain and the wood smoke from the first fires of the season. I was 22, my hands calloused from work, my future as solid and real as the simple gold band I'd saved 6 months to buy. It was in my pocket then, a secret weight against my thigh, as I walked up the porch steps of June's family home. Her mother answered the door, her face a pale, crumpled mask of distress. She didn't speak, just handed me a single sheet of notebook paper, folded once. My name was on the outside, written in June's looping, graceful hand. The world seemed to slow. The sounds of the chickens in the yard and a distant tractor all fading into a dull hum. I unfolded the paper. The words were few. They were like little bullets, each one finding its mark. I am so sorry. I can't do this. Earl makes me feel alive. That was all. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a line drawn through my heart, signed with his name. I remembered the physical sensation most clearly, a cold numbness starting in my fingers and spreading up my arms, into my chest, freezing the air in my lungs. Earl, my best friend since we were boys catching frogs down at the creek, the one I'd trusted with my dreams, with my secrets, with the map of my future. He had been here, in the space I had created with my own absence. While I was 50 miles away, helping my father bring in the last of the harvest, he had been here, planting weeds in my garden. The engagement ring felt like a lead weight in my pocket. I don't remember leaving that porch or the drive home. I remember standing in the middle of my own room, the note still in my hand, and the numbness finally breaking, not into tears but into a silent, tectonic rage that had no outlet. There was no one to shout at, no one to fight. The betrayal was a fait accompli, delivered on a piece of paper. A month later, they were married. The town talked, of course they did, but Earl was charming, loud, the kind of man who could talk a cop out of a ticket and a farmer out of his prized tractor. He smiled that big, easy smile of his, shrugged it off as a matter of the heart, and people, bafflingly, seemed to accept it. He was a force of nature. I was just the aftermath. So, I left. I packed a single bag, got in my truck, and drove until the familiar flatlands gave way to hills and then to mountains. I found work building houses in Colorado. There was a purity in the work, in the smell of fresh-cut pine and the sure straight line of a well-set wall. For 20 years, I built other people's homes, their futures, while my own remained a vacant lot back in that small town. I stayed quiet. I worked with my hands. I tried with every swing of the hammer to drive the memory of them out of my head. But a man can't outrun his own roots, not when they're tangled around the bones of his parents. When they passed within a year of each other, I had to go back. The town I returned to was the same, yet utterly different. The streets were the same, the buildings were the same, but I was a ghost walking through them, a relic of a story everyone remembered, but no one wanted to discuss. I was the living, breathing reminder of an unpleasantness, a crack in the town's perfect facade. People were polite, but their eyes slid away from mine. I was the man Earl had bested, and small towns have no patience for permanent victims. And Earl, he was still here. Older, thicker around the middle, but still wearing that politician's smile. He'd taken over his father's hardware store, joined the town council, his face smiling out from every fundraiser photo in the local paper. He had landed on his feet, as people like him always do. He had absorbed my life into his own and suffered no ill effects. June had passed a few years before my return. Cancer, they said. A part of me, the young man frozen in 1968, felt a fresh, complicated grief at that news. The woman I had loved was gone, and the last image I had of her was blurred, refracted through the prism of Earl's betrayal. He had worn black for 6 months, people told me, as if I needed to know he'd performed his grief adequately. Then he started dating again, a widow from the next county over. The world for Earl kept on turning, offering up new opportunities. For a long time, I simply existed on the outskirts of town, tending my parents' old place, living a life of quiet routine. The rage had banked, but it had not gone out. It was a bed of coals deep in my chest, waiting for a breath of air. That breath came one ordinary afternoon at the gas station on Main Street. I was filling my tank when I heard the familiar, frustrated cursing. I looked over. There he was, Earl. The hood of his expensive new truck was up, and he was staring into the engine bay as if it had personally insulted him. He was red-faced, sweating despite the cool day. He saw me looking. For a single, unguarded moment, the famous grin faded, replaced by a flicker of surprise and something else, a faint, lingering shadow of the guilt he should have carried all his life. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice a little wheezy. "You still alive?" The coals in my chest glowed. I smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, but he wouldn't have known that. He only saw what I wanted him to see. "Guess so," I said, my voice even. "Need a hand?" I saw the war on his face, pride fighting practicality. He was a man who relied on his charm and his presence, not his mechanical skill. Finally, he nodded, a curt, embarrassed gesture. "Won't turn down a second set of eyes." I walked over. It was a loose battery cable, a simple, stupid fix. I tightened it with a wrench from my own truck, the connection snapping back to life with a faint spark. "Try it now," I said. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. He looked from the purring engine back at me, that old grin sliding back into place, but it was weaker now, tempered by a need. "Obliged," he said. "Guess some things you don't forget." "No," I said, looking directly into his eyes. "Some things you don't." And in that moment, the plan was born. Not a plan of violence or of confrontation. Those are the weapons of the young and impatient. I was an old man. I understood the power of erosion. I had seen how water, given enough time, could carve through granite. I would be that water. The town saw a simple act of decency. They saw the victim helping the victor, and they loved the symmetry of it. They loved the idea that we had mended old wounds. I let them think that. The truth was, I had just begun to study him, and I liked what I saw. That first tightened battery cable was the first thread in a new invisible bond between us. The town, ever eager for a narrative of redemption, sewed it into a tapestry of reconciliation. I became a willing needle in their hands. It started with small talk, a nod at the diner that turned into a shared cup of coffee. I'd let him do most of the talking. He'd hold court, telling the same polished stories I'd heard him tell for decades, but now there was a new audience of one. Me. I learned to listen with a face of quiet interest, while inside I was a geologist studying a specimen, noting every fissure, every weakness. He was heavier, his face florid. I saw the slight wince when he stood up too fast, the way he'd press a hand almost unconsciously to the center of his chest after climbing a short flight of stairs. He took pills. A small plastic container he'd slipped from his pocket with a furtive glance around before tipping a tiny white tablet into his palm. He called them his ticker-talkers, making a joke of his own mortality. "Doc says I gotta lay off the salt, the coffee, the steak. Hell, what's the point of living if you can't live a little?" I'd nod sympathetically. "A man's gotta have his pleasures, Earl. They can't wrap you in cotton wool." His eyes would light up with gratitude. I was the only one, he claimed, who didn't treat him like a walking corpse. His new lady friend, the widow from the next county, nagged him constantly about his diet. His doctor was a killjoy. But me? I understood him. I was his ally in defiance. The invitation to his house came naturally. A fence post needed setting, a leaky faucet needed fixing. Tasks that were just slightly too much for him now. I arrived with my tools, the same ones I'd used to build houses out west, and a covered dish. "What's this?" he asked, peering at the lemon loaf cake I handed him. "Something sweet," I said. "Figured you could use it." He beamed, that old, brilliant smile that had once felt like the sun. Now it just looked like a faulty lamp, burning too hot, too fast. "You're a damned saint, you know that?" I just smiled and went to work on the fence. Inside his home, the house he had built with June, I was an archaeologist in a tomb of my own stolen life. I saw her touches everywhere, frozen in time, a faded crocheted blanket draped over a chair, a particular pattern in the curtains, a faint scent of lavender that had somehow lingered in the fibers of the house, a ghost in the mortar. It was a physical ache, a hollowing out of my insides, but I let the pain fuel me. I sharpened my purpose on it. He'd talk about her, casually, carelessly. "June always loved this view," he'd say, looking out the back window. Or, "This was her favorite chair." Once, his eyes misty with sentimentality that I knew was as deep as a puddle, he said, "She was always my girl, you know? right from the start. The coals in my chest flared white-hot. My girl. The words from the note echoed across a lifetime. I had to turn away, pretending to examine a warped floorboard until I could school my face back into its mask of calm commiseration. She was a special woman, I managed to say, my voice gravel. That she was, he sighed, completely missing the tectonic shift in the room. He saw only what he wanted to see, an old friend sharing a memory. That's when the ledger in my mind began. It was a simple, brutal accounting. Every smirk, every boast, every casual mention of June that felt like a violation was a debit. Every wheeze, every wince, every pill he popped was a credit. My goal was to bring the balance to 0. I made myself indispensable. I was the helpful, quiet friend who asked for nothing in return. I dropped by with a pie, heavy with butter and sugar. The widow down the lane gave me too many apples, I'd lie. He'd devour 2 slices with a glass of whole milk, laughing about cheating his diet. I learned his routines. I knew when his doctor's appointments were, and I'd conveniently show up an hour after he returned home, when the doctor's warnings were fresh and irritating in his mind. He says my blood pressure is up again, Earl would grouse, pouring himself a cup of strong black coffee. He says I should switch to decaf. Decaf, I'd snort, pouring myself a cup from his pot, topping up his mug. One more won't hurt. He'd laugh, a wet rattling sound deep in his chest. You're right. You're damn right. I became his accomplice. When he complained the food his lady friend prepared was bland, all steamed vegetables and no salt, I started bringing over my own leftovers. A hearty beef stew, rich and salty. A shepherd's pie with a double thick layer of buttery mashed potatoes. I'd watch him eat, savoring every heavy, grateful bite. You're a better cook than she is, he'd say, patting his swollen stomach. It's the salt, I'd say lightly, brings out the flavor. He had no idea that I was the flavor I was bringing out, the flavor of his own decline. There were moments of doubt, of course, in the deep quiet of the night, lying in my own bed in the house where I'd grown up. I would wonder at the man I had become. The young man I had been, the one who loved June and trusted Earl, would have been horrified. This was a cold, patient malice he couldn't have comprehended. But that young man had been murdered in the fall of '68. What was left was his ghost. And ghosts are patient creatures. They have all the time in the world. The seasons turned. The corn grew tall and green, then withered to gold, then was cut down to stubble. And with each cycle, Earl grew a little slower, a little more breathless. His boasts about cheating his diet became more frequent, more defiant, as if he was proving his vitality to himself and to me. I was his willing audience, his cheerleader on the road to ruin. The final piece of my strategy fell into place during a cold snap in early December. I found him shivering in his garage, trying to haul a bag of rock salt for his driveway. His face was a terrifying shade of gray. "For God's sake, Earl, let me," I said, taking the bag from his hands. His fingers were cold and clammy. "Stupid heart," he gasped, leaning against the workbench. "Makes me weak as a kitten." He was scared. For the first time, I saw genuine, unvarnished fear in his eyes. The invincible Earl Peterson was confronting his own fragile machinery. That's when I suggested the walks. "Doctor's right about one thing," I said, my tone folksy and reasonable. "You need to move, but not alone. What if you fall? How about we take a walk each afternoon, just a short one, down to the end of the lane and back?" He looked at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic gratitude. "You'd do that for me?" "It's no trouble," I said. "We'll look out for each other." And so we began. Every afternoon, rain or shine, we would walk. But I always chose the route, a deceptively gentle incline that put a steady, silent strain on his cardiovascular system. I set a pace that was just a little too brisk for him, chatting amiably about the weather or town gossip, forcing him to conserve his breath, to push through the discomfort. He'd huff and puff, his hand going to his chest. "You set a mean pace, old friend." "Gotta keep the blood pumping," I'd reply cheerfully, not slowing down. "It's good for you." I was his personal trainer, diligently guiding him toward his finish line. He trusted me completely. He believed I was his salvation, while I was in fact his most dedicated executioner. The war was not a loud, explosive affair. It was a quiet, daily siege, and I was starving the garrison. The end began on a Tuesday. It was unseasonably warm for early spring, the air thick with the promise of rain and the smell of wet earth. The walk that day had been harder than usual. Earl had been unusually quiet, his breathing a labored whistle. He'd stopped twice, pretending to admire the first crocuses pushing through the dirt, but I saw the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the tightness around his mouth. "Feeling all right, Earl?" I asked, my voice laden with concern. "Fine, fine," he wheezed, waving a dismissive hand. "Just a bit of indigestion from lunch." He'd had a helping of my leftover sausage and potato casserole, extra salty. I walked him to his door. "You get some rest. I'll check on you tomorrow." He nodded, his eyes already distant, focused on some internal distress. "Yeah, tomorrow. Thanks. Thanks for everything." There was a strange finality in his tone, a form of goodbye he didn't know he was making. I just patted his shoulder and turned away, my own heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. I didn't go home. I got in my truck and drove to the old overlook at the edge of town, where you could see the patchwork of fields stretching to the horizon. I sat there for an hour, watching the storm clouds gather and roll, dark and heavy. I felt preternaturally calm. The ledger was almost balanced. The air felt charged, the way it does before a lightning strike. A feeling, cold and certain, settled in my bones. It was time. I drove back to his house slowly, the first fat drops of rain starting to hit my windshield. I didn't park in the drive. I pulled off on the shoulder behind the line of scrub trees and walked the rest of the way through the neighboring field, the wet earth clinging to my boots. I didn't know what I expected to see. Perhaps I just needed to witness the final act of my long-played game. I saw him through the big kitchen window. He was on his feet, but moving erratically, one hand clawing at the front of his shirt. His face was a mask of panic and pain. He stumbled toward the phone on the wall, but his legs gave out halfway there. He collapsed onto the linoleum floor, a heavy, ungainly heap. He lay there, motionless for a moment, then tried to push himself up. He couldn't. His body was no longer his to command. I stood in the rain, watching from the shadows beyond the window. I felt no triumph, no glee, just a profound, silent stillness. This was the crop I had planted and tended for years. This was the harvest. I waited. I counted the seconds, listening to the rain patter on the leaves above me. I waited until all movement in the kitchen had ceased, until the last struggle for breath had ended. I waited until I was sure. Then, and only then, I walked calmly around to the front door, let myself in with the key he'd given me for emergencies, and made the call. My voice was perfectly measured, filled with the right amount of shock and grief when I spoke to the dispatcher. I knelt beside him as we waited for the ambulance, but I did not touch him. I just looked at him. The famous smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed rictus of surprise. The charm had finally failed. The force of nature had been neutralized by a force far more patient and implacable. The paramedics were swift and professional. They confirmed what I already knew. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, put a hand on my shoulder. "You did all you could for him, sir." I met his gaze, my own eyes appropriately watery. The tear I had practiced at the funeral was ready now, genuine in its source, if not in its sentiment. It was the tear for a journey ended, for a debt finally paid. "I know," I said, my voice breaking just right. "I know I did." I had done exactly what I set out to do. I had been his best friend until the very end. I had helped his heart give out. The aftermath was a play in which I knew my part perfectly. The grieving friend, the stalwart rock. I arranged the funeral, chose the casket, and stood by the grave as they lowered him down. I accepted the casseroles and the condolences with a grace that fooled everyone. They all said it. "It's good you two finally made peace." And I would nod, a sad, wise smile on my face. It is. It truly is. Peace. They talk about it like it's a gentle thing, a soft blanket of forgiveness. They don't understand that for some of us, peace is not the absence of war. It is the victory. It is the quiet that settles over the battlefield after the last enemy has fallen. It is the profound, unassailable silence that comes when the score is settled, when the ledger is balanced to zero. I walk through the town now, and I am no longer a ghost. I am a monument. They see me and they see a story of redemption, a testament to the human capacity for forgiveness. They see a good man. I let them. Their misunderstanding is the final perfect layer of my revenge. It belongs to me alone. I sometimes visit both graves. I stand between them. On one side, June, the girl with the kind smile who made the world feel smaller. I don't blame her anymore. She was a bird charmed by a snake, and she lived and died in that gilded cage. I feel a distant, weathered sadness for her. On the other side, Earl, the best friend, the thief, the man who thought he could take what was mine and suffer no consequence. He died believing I was the one person who saw the man he once was, not the patient he had become. He died thinking he was loved. I look from her headstone to his, and I feel the deep, cold stillness inside me. The coals are out. The fire is banked. There is only ash, and from that ash, a quiet, enduring peace. The war I started at 22 is over. I am 79. It was a long war, but I had the patience for it. I had the time, and in the end, I won. What does true justice look like when the law has no say? Is patience the deadliest weapon? Subscribe for new videos that explore the dark, quiet corners of the human heart.